Hello, Intro to Metalwork and Jewelry. Today we're going to go over one of the most important skills that you are going to learn in metalworking, and that is using a saw and using it properly and how to cut metal. This is something that we're going to use for every single project that we do from here on out. Cutting metal is an integral part to metalwork and jewelry. So in your kit, you'll find a couple things that I gave you. I'll go over them real quick. I gave you a coping saw. This is a jeweler's coping saw. So you'll see that it does adjust. You also have a bench pin, which is what this is right here, this wooden block. You have a clamp. You have a chunk of beeswax. You have different pieces of metal, so you have copper, you have brass, and silver. And then you have a couple different bundles of saw blades. I gave you a lot of saw blades because you're going to need them, especially when you learn how to cut. You are going to break these. So don't worry that you are snapping them. Just be mindful of what you're doing and pay attention to how you're cutting, and it will get easier. And then I have a couple little single saw blades right here so that I can show them to you. We can look at them. So in order to begin, you want to make sure that you set your space up somewhere. It's not in your bedroom. You don't want to get this in the carpet just because metal dust will fall as you're cutting, and it'll be a pain to vacuum it up. So I would do somewhere that has a nice floor, a smoother floor, whether that is outside, if it's not too cold out and you have an outside picnic table or a deck or something like that where you can work. A kitchen table, a countertop, anywhere that's kind of, that's nothing that's too expensive and that also will not drop into carpet if you can help it. So you want to preserve your table. That's why we're not cutting directly on the table, plus it's a lot harder. So the first thing you're going to do is get your bench pin, and you're going to attach it to the desk, or table, or whatever you have. Make sure you're not using anything too expensive or really nice, because potentially with this clamp, depending on how tightly you tighten it, you may get clamp marks onto your table, and that would be something that you wouldn't want to do. So you just want to get it so it's tight enough that this isn't really moving. It doesn't have to be like super tight. Like, you're not going to be yanking on this, but you don't want to have it moving back and forth like that when you're working. All right, so the next step is setting up your saw. Now, this looks a little intimidating at first. You'll notice the saw has two ends. So it's got two pieces that you clamp. What you want to do is suspend the saw between here and here. Also, then you'll tighten up the back so it shouldn't move at all. With your saw blades, you'll notice that your saw blades are in a bundle, and that bundle is wrapped in wire. And they are a little oily, so they do put oil on these saw blades so they don't get stuck together. So your hands will get a little oily. You want to make sure that you wash them when you're done. But all you do to unwrap these is, and you might have to try both sides, but you hold the end where the wire is between your fingers, and you twist, and that should help loosen it, or at least make it slide off a little bit. So what you're trying to do is just find that loose end. And if you're having a hard time and you just can't find it with your fingers as you swirl it, all you have to do is get a pair of scissors, if you have them. Here we go. So as you're twisting it, once you find the end, you'll notice the wire loosens up. But all you have to do is get a pair of scissors and cut the end gently. You don't want to cut through the saw blades, just cut the end. And then you're going to hold the wire, and you're going to twirl the bundle till it's loose. Now put these saw blades somewhere safe, because you only have so many, so don't put them anywhere they're going to get thrown out, or where you'll accidentally lose them. They are small, so you do want to keep track of them. Also, because they're kind of oily, and if you are working somewhere, you might want to put a paper towel underneath of them, just so that your surface doesn't get oily as well. And then, like I said, what you're going to want to do is wash your hands afterwards to get any of that grease or oil off. Now, when you get started putting your saw blade in, the most important thing you need to pay attention to is where your teeth are. And I'm going to make this a separate slide in the folder, so make sure that you go back and look at that, especially if you're not sure. If you look at these saw blades up close, you'll see that there's teeth on one side of them. The tooth is where the sharp edges are. This is the part that cuts. There's another smooth side on the back opposite it. So when you're cutting, you want to make sure your teeth are facing outwards. So when you're cutting your saw, you want to make sure that they're pointing away from you. The teeth should be pointing out, not towards you. If they're turned towards you, then that means you're going to be trying to cut where there's no blades on your saw and nothing is going to happen. So you always want to make sure that your teeth are pointing away from you. Also, something to remember, this is a saw blade. It is very thin and it is very small. It doesn't look that big and bad. But if your fingers are in the way, you can potentially get cut with the saw, and what that will end up being like is like a paper cut. You're not going to cut your finger off. You're not going to, cut an artery. If you nick yourself with it, you will get a little paper cut type of a cut. And if that does happen, stop what you're doing, go to the sink, use some soap and some water and wash it, get a Band-Aid if you want to, and then dry your hands. That is why the most important thing when we are sawing is that you aren't talking to someone else, you're not distracted, and you're actually paying attention to what you're doing. So as far as safety goes, you need to pay attention to what you're cutting. It's never a good idea to not pay attention to what you're cutting. All right, so in order to put the saw in, what you want to do is lay the saw flat on the table, so you're holding it up with your non-dominant hand. And you're going to unscrew one of the ends. And then you're going to put the end of the saw blade into that end. Press it so it's all the way up against it. And then you're going to tighten it. Now, you don't want to tighten it too much so that you can't unscrew it, but you want it to be tight enough. So it should be in there so it's not really moving around. Also, when you put your saw in the saw blade, and again, this will be in the diagram that I share with you, you want to make sure that your teeth are pointing down. So teeth point down when you put your saw in. So what that means is I can run my finger down the saw blade and it doesn't really hurt. If I were to run my finger up, it would catch on my skin. So then the other end of this, which is probably not going to show very well. See the end of my saw blade? You want this to sit right inside this little clamp part. You do not want it to stick out further. And you don't want it to be just inside because it makes it hard to grip. So you want it to fill up this entire spot in here if you can help it. So then what I will do is I will tighten the back of the saw because I don't want it moving anymore. Like this is a perfect size. I don't want it moving up and down. So tighten the back. And then the most important thing when you tighten your saw blade is that you want to tighten it either by holding it with your hand or pressing it against your belly. But you want to tighten the saw blade and then release it. And what happens is because you're pressing against the saw blade, it's contracting. You're tightening it, and when you let it go, it will constrict back a little bit so it doesn't move. You don't want the saw blade to move at all. If it's moving or if it's wiggling, then it's not tight enough and you need to tighten it up again. If your saw blade is not tight, it will break within seconds of you trying to use it. So you want to make sure it's tight in here. It should also make a taunt noise like that. Like a guitar string almost, when you pluck it. But it should not move. It shouldn't wiggle. There's a little bit of give here you can see, but not like a lot. So now I'm ready to saw. Now, you have a little piece of beeswax, and I gave each one of you this, and do not tear this apart, because we need to save these for next year. We want to save them for the spring and reuse them. This will help to lubricate your saw when you're cutting, because when you're cutting with metal, it'll cause friction. And it'll make it harder to cut sometimes. So this will just make it easier. So all you have to do with your beeswax is you just run it over the saw once, and then that'll kind of lubricate it and make it a little easier. As you're cutting, if you notice it's getting harder to cut, stop, beeswax, and then cut again. So keep this with you. Do not cut it apart and tear it in little pieces. All right, so now you have your bench pin here. You got your saw ready to go. Now what you want to do is figure out, which you should know, which hand is your dominant hand. That's the one you're going to cut with. That's the one you write with. And you're going to adjust your chair so that your shoulder and your arm line up with this bench pin. So you can see this bench pin, I've got a straight line of my arm, and if you could see, comes straight up my shoulder. So this is a straight line. You want to line up your whole arm with the bench pin where you're going to be cutting. You don't want to be cutting across your body. You want to be cutting like straight from your body. Also, any tension you have in your arm is going to transfer right to that saw blade, so you want to make sure that you are calm, you take your time, and you're relaxed. In the beginning, it's going to be a little hard, but you want to calm, take your time, and relax. You don't have anything to be worried about with this. Like I said, if you were to cut your fingers, it would be just like a little paper cut, which hurts. It hurts. but you're not going to cut your finger off. Like this will be very neat and easy for you to do. So what you want to do when you're cutting is that you're going to, and you can see how my arm is lined up here. You want to hold this like you're shaking someone's hand. You don't want to hold it with like a death grip, like, you know, tense muscles. You also don't want to hold it like loose, like, you know, you want to have a straight, good grip on the handle. You also want to hold it straight up and down like this. So when you're cutting, you're actually cutting straight. You're not cutting like a saw, like you'd be sawing wood. You're not cutting from side to side. By having it side to side, it will break. You want to make sure it's straight up and down, and then it's always straight up and down. So if your chair is too high for what you're doing, find another chair if you can. But you're going to be cutting straight up and down like this. So straight, not on an angle, 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 straight. So straight up and down, and relax. So you're moving your arm up and down like this when you're cutting. So with your metal, I want you to choose one of the ones you're going to cut. You're going to make some practice cuts first. Now, with the metal that I gave you, do not cut anything out from the center of it. You're going to try and use as much of that metal as possible. So what we want to do, always start with the outside, with the ends. And you want to try and squeeze your sketches when we do the project, squeeze them onto the metal so you can use as much metal as possible and you don't waste it. If you take your project and you stick something right in the center, then you're wasting all the space around it. So when you're cutting and when you're working, you want to make sure that you use your ends. So I took a piece of copper, scrap metal, and you want to draw a straight line, a curved line, and a zigzag line. Now they don't have to be right up on top of each other. In fact, it's better if you give them a little bit of space. Again, though, I would not, space it out a lot so you're wasting metal. This is just practicing to cut. This will end up in the trash. You will not keep this. So make sure you put them pretty close together like I did. And if you don't have a Sharpie available to you, use a pencil or a pen. It'll work pretty well. Sharpies work best, but either one of them will work. So when you're working, you're going to use this notch in your bench pin that you have. That's where you're going to cut. You're not going to cut on the metal. You're going to cut in the notch. And what that does is that allows you to hold your metal down. As you're cutting, you can hold both sides. So this is where you kind of get a little bit of a contortionist type of a thing, depending on how you're holding your metal. Will depend on how you place your fingers. So when I'm ready to cut, I'm going to hold this down with my fingers. I'm going to hold my saw straight up and down, and I'm going to get a good first cut right there. And what that does is gets me in a little notch in my metal so that I have a line to cut on. Now remember, straight up and down. I'm relaxed, I'm calm, and I'm cutting straight up and down. Keep on moving your metal as you need to. Once you start cutting into the wood, it's just going to make it that much harder for you to cut. If your metal is bouncing while you're cutting, get a better grip and really hold it down. That's what you need to hold it down with your finger, because if you don't hold it down, then it is going to move around. And if it moves around, it'll break your saw blade. When you get to the end, slow down, because your piece is going to pop off. There you have it. Now, when you start again, you can put more beeswax on the saw blade if you want to. The single most important thing that you need to remember when you're cutting is that you pay attention to what you're doing. When you have someone talking to you or you're doing something else and you're not paying attention, that's when bad things can happen. So you need to be watching what you're doing when you're working. Again, I'm going to make, now on a curved line, I'm going to not hold my saw straight. I'm going to make my saw line up with that line I want to cut and get a first little dent in there made, first little mark. With sawing, if I don't pay attention to what I'm doing and my finger is here and my saw blade breaks, let me show you what it looks like when you break a saw blade. And usually it's because it's like really jerky and like rough cutting. Of course, I can't break a blade if I try to. there we go. So when you break a saw blade, you'll see sometimes you lose the whole end of the saw, which is another reason you don't want to cut on your bedroom floor because you'll step on it. And sometimes you don't. Sometimes it just breaks. Now, if I'm cutting metal and my saw blade breaks and I'm not paying attention because I'm talking to somebody else and I'm looking elsewhere, I'm not even looking at what I'm doing. If you keep trying to cut and that saw blade's on there, potentially it can end up, like if you're pressing, it can go into your finger, which means you'd kind of be impaled by the saw blade. If you're here and I send you to the nurse will not take it out because she does not know how far in it went and if anything broke inside your fingertip. So she will have your parent come pick you up and take you over to Riddle Hospital, which you will then get an x-ray of your finger to determine if it is broken in there. If it's not broken, your best case scenario is they pull it out. If it is broken inside your finger, then I had one student years ago who had to have surgery to have it removed. You don't want to go to Riddle Hospital. You don't want to have an x-ray. You don't want to have your parents come pick you up in the middle of the day. If you're at home, you're going to have to tell your parents, and the same thing will happen. They will take you to Riddle Hospital, and then you will have to have an x-ray, and you will have to have it taken out. So, a long story short, when you are cutting metal, pay attention to what you are doing. Because if you don't, bad things can happen. But if you're paying attention to what you're doing, you'll see that you break it if you break it, and then you'll stop. All right, so let me put another saw blade in here. Remember, press against the table, release it, let it go. Make sure it's not wiggling too much. So you're going to use your fingers. Hold this down on your bench pin. You're going to cut your curved line. Now I have a new saw blade, so I want to run it over my beeswax. That's embarrassing. See, that's how easy that they can break. And that's why you want to pay attention to what you're doing. Again, always make sure that your saw blade is pointed out. And the teeth are pointed down. Also, something else to remember is that if your saw blade does break and you replace the blade and you notice that it's not, it's slipping out, that can be because there's a little piece of saw blade stuck in the clamp part of your saw, which will then make it keep popping out. So this is where you can also use two fingers here. You're going to cut. So just keep turning your metal and cutting your saw relaxed and calm, eyes down, so you know what you're doing. Like, watch what you're doing, and then just keep turning your metal as you need to. Also, make sure you don't slam the saw down, because, you know, you're going to hurt your finger. I'm not going to lie, that does hurt. Then the last one is your zigzag line. So my line kind of disappeared because I've been touching it. So zigzag lines are hard lines to cut, and I'm going to show you why. So you're going to get it cut, started, and you're going to cut up to your first stop, right there. Now, you can't just turn your saw like you would a car and follow the line, because you're going to break your saw blade. So these are the hardest ones to get used to. Once you get used to making a 90-degree turn or any sort of like a sharp turn like that, super easy, but getting used to it is a little tough. So what you're going to do is you're going to move it up and down slowly, but not press forward. So see, I'm not cutting it, I'm just moving it up and down. As you move it up and down, you're going to slowly turn it a little bit each time. Slowly turning your saw blade and your saw. And then you're going to turn it until you get back on that line. And then you can turn the whole setup. So again, that your fingers are comfortable. Uh-oh, I got to another one. Now what? Same thing. Moving it up and down. And turning it. And then I continue on my way.